Hello and welcome to Professor M Explains. Today we're going to talk about the cultural context of interpersonal communication. In this chapter, we're going to summarize the four main components of cultural context of interpersonal communication. That is the basic elements of cultural context, cultural differences in nonverbal communication, cultural differences in the use of language, as well as implications for intercultural encounters. First of all, the summary of this section in this body of work discusses that as an American society continues to become more culturally diverse, the need to understand and appreciate the cultural context of interpersonal communication is super important. When we're looking at this dichotomy, we're looking at the shared beliefs, the values, the customs, and the symbols of a particular group. When we analyze those in the nature and understanding of interpersonal communication, it becomes of greater importance that we understand the cultural framework that one's cultural identity takes place in their cultural context, because all of it is interrelated. Our cultural identity is a major component of who we are. Examples of cultural identity are ethnicity and race. When we look at the darker side of cultural identity, which is earmarked in this area of discussion, we're also talking about the cultural identity and the fact that ethnicity and race can surface under conditions of extreme ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Our cultural frame of reference consists of the judgments that are directly influenced by the experiences that we share with other members of our culture. In general, cultural differences in value orientations and person perceptions have a significant impact on interpersonal communication. As cultures differ in their nonverbal communication preferences, which include important differences in physical appearance, personal space, the way someone gazes, the way they engage in touch, in communication or in the communication process, their facial expressions, gestures, and even vocal expressions varies from culture to culture. In addition, cultures differ in their use of language. One view maintains that different languages reflect and promote different worldviews. Research on language features and language effects offers some support for this idea. Now, when we understand the verbal communication, the styles also differ there according to culture. For example, some cultures are more likely to prefer high context communication, whereas other cultures prefer low context communication. In everyday life, the cultural context of interpersonal communication directly influences the way we engage, converse, and even manage conflict with others. Cultures are also intergenerational, with life events impacting how members of a generation frame issues and perspectives on what's important. Intergenerational culture is particularly important in workplace and family contexts. We also want to make sure that we understand, in delving into this information regarding cultural context, that the context is also, when we approach the generational perspective, we talk about lifespan. We're going to talk about that in chapter 14 for some of you who have jumped ahead. But for now, let's do an aerial overview of the basic elements of cultural context. The question begins, we ask ourselves, what is cultural identity? Cultural identity, as we discussed in previous lectures, is a combination of us knowing who we are and what makes us different or unique from others. Also, cultural identity can include our nationality, our race, our religion, our gender, our age, and even our social class. Now, where does one develop their cultural identity? One develops their cultural identity from many places, but one place we do not develop it is from birth. When we are birthed and we come into this world, we do not have identity automatically bestowed upon us. We acquire it through our relationships with our family and our environment. In fact, Finney has a 3-stage process that was developed in order for people to understand how their cultural identity can be developed. Stage 1 understands the process of what's called unexamined cultural identity. During this stage in the process, people tend to show little to no interest in exploring their cultural background. They may not even be aware of prevailing stereotypes about their culture, and they may not even understand the importance of identifying and learning about their cultural identity so as that they can have improved interpersonal communications and connections with the world around them. Stage 2 discusses a cultural identity search. At some point, Finney theorized that he hopes individuals will wish to learn more about their cultural background and may begin doing some research, questioning their parents, relatives, and friends, or perhaps even reading books, articles, or enrolling in special courses. What we're seeing today is that some people are taking DNA tests, or they're going to ancestry.com to find out and to learn the basis of their cultural identity. Stage 3 of this process discusses cultural identity achievement. In this final stage, people accept themselves as a member of a distinct cultural group. They begin to become knowledgeable about their culture, and they learn to appreciate what their culture has to offer. Now, also in this stage, Feeney discusses the dark side of cultural identity, and where a person may then learn that their cultural identity class has in the past or continue currently to deal with prejudice as well as negative influences placed upon their stereotype. This in turn contributes to increased self-esteem or decrease in self-esteem. Members of a dominant cultural group then become more aware of prejudice that is directed against minority groups. We've seen this in the news. We've seen this with some mega celebrities saying derogatory things about cultural groups. And we have also seen the masses of people support in opposition to statements that isolate and alienate a particular culture or people who identify with a cultural group that has historically been marginalized. Now, when we talk about two terms that are important, I want you to understand that ethnocentrism is a very important term, and it was coined by a Yale University sociologist, and it's related to the belief that one's culture is the center of everything and therefore is superior to other cultures. When we consider this, it encourages people to apply norms and standards of their own culture when judging other cultures. This perpetuates and can lead to discrimination and intergroup hostilities. Now, much worse than ethnocentrism is what's called xenophobia. Xenophobia has been defined as an irrational state of mind of an abnormal fear or hatred of foreigners. Unfortunately, we saw this being enacted in our world when COVID came out, and COVID was expressly and unfairly attached to a particular ethnicity group. We saw fear and we saw an escalation of violence against a particular group. that was absolutely horrific and unjustified, uncalled for, and barbaric. But when you look at these two frameworks in which cultural identity can be placed in, there's great piece to cultural identity of knowing who you are, what group you belong to. So you could celebrate those cultures. You could celebrate what makes you as an individual unique, but also understand that there's a darker side to cultural identity, and it's the subjective and subconscious stereotypes that people carry with that cultural identity. And they place on other people who are having to deal with just the backlash, unnecessary backlash of wanting to celebrate who they are. Now, when we move on and we talk about cultural frame of reference, the cultural frame of reference is connected to one's value orientations and a person's perceptions. There are two distinct areas I want you to understand that are relevant to our discussion. That's value orientations and person perceptions. Let's first talk about the relevance of value orientations. Scholars over the years have discovered that there are some values that we take for granted in our own culture that are not shared by persons in many other cultures. We look at these and categorize them into two areas. One is individualistic, and the other is collectivist. Let's begin. With value orientations, we have individualism, inequality, masculinity, uncertainty, and time orientation. With person perceptions, we're going to talk about the communicative process of analyzing the being of other people. So let's talk first about individualism and inequality. Masculinity, uncertainty, and time orientation, and how they measure up to different cultural identities. So when we're speaking of an individualism standpoint, we're talking about the dimension that represents the degree to which individuals are integrated in a group. In an individualistic culture, their ties between people are very loose. For the most part, people learn to look out for themselves, their immediate family. In contrast, collectivistic cultures encourage interdependence among members, teaching them the importance of allegiance to intergroups, such as work groups and extended families. It also provides continued protection in exchange for unquestioned loyalty. The nature of a person's self-concept will differ in individualistic cultures as compared to collectivist cultures. Now, when you look in the book, please take note just to see an example of this. When we look at individualism, the United States ranks high on that list when we look at the nations that are rated highest or lowest in the 5 dimensions. Understand that when we balance that out from an individualistic versus a collectivistic outlook, individualistic, just think about a sole lone ranger, okay? They're separate from others, they're stable, they're internal, they're very private, they're very unique, expressive, they promote their own goals, they're very direct-minded, and they have the ability to express themselves and validate internal attributes. When we looked at a collectivist point of view, they're connected to others. This is the village concept. They're flexible, they're external, they're very public. They belong or fit in. They stay in their place. They promote others' goals. They are indirect. They support the notion of being indirect and kind of reading each other's minds. And their basis of self-esteem is the ability to adjust and restrain to maintain social harmony. Whereas on the individualist side, the ability to express themselves and validate their internal attributes is a stronger quality. So again, there are these balances in cultural identity and norms that are super important, and they play out in value orientations. Let's talk about inequality. When we look at inequality, we're understanding the term of power distance. That means a society's willingness to accept unequal distributions of power. The key factor in assessing power distance in a culture is the degree to which the less powerful people in that culture expect and accept inequality. Two things I want to mention here. One, individualism. If you think back, an example of this is, when communities say it takes a community, it takes a village to raise a child. This is an example of a collectivistic culture where everyone pitches in, everyone takes care of each other, and they look after each other and they take care of one another's needs. An example of this could be reference to the hurricane in Florida, where you saw and read in the news, and you saw in the news where communities came together, they banded together, they collected the water, the food, they rationed the resources that they had, and they banded together, family or not, and they made sure that everyone in that community took care of one another until FEMA could come and provide resources for them. When we look at an example of inequality, we can consider what we're seeing as protests that are brewing around the country, around the world, protests in various countries that are now demanding equal access, equal opportunity to be treated as equals instead of this power distance that has been expressive in their culture. So when you're thinking about these two paradigms of value orientations, those are two examples that you can cling on to and apply to this. Now, when we move to masculinity, this is a culture's preference for male over female values. In a highly masculine culture, people are more likely to endorse assertive and competitive behavior versus in a more feminine culture where people are more likely to endorse caring, cooperative behavior. Understand the dichotomy between these two, and then let's look at uncertainty. This deals with a culture's lack of tolerance for ambiguity, also referred to as uncertainty avoidance. In cultures high in uncertainty avoidance, people are uncomfortable in unstructured situations. They are, by definition, novel and surprising. People in such cultures are more likely to want guidance from laws, rules, instructions, rituals, than they are not having that structure of cultural identity and what communities offer the citizens that are a part of that community. Let's discuss person perceptions. When we're understanding person perceptions, the definition is the process of making sense of other people. Our cultural background influences this process in many ways. Perhaps the most important way is to the degree in which we see each other as being a part of, rather than apart from, our cultural group that we affiliate with. So understand, as we are reviewing this chapter, there is a distinction between the two. Person's perceptions, the communicative process of analyzing the being of other people. So let's talk about cultural differences in nonverbal communication. When we're talking about cultural differences, we can tie this to earlier chapters, and we also can tie this to our CAP project, in which we talked about our personal identification and our concept of self. But this is also impactful when we talk about cultural differences in nonverbal communication. We have a physical appearance. We have personal space, gaze, and touch that are indicative of cultural identity. When we talk about personal space, gaze, and touch, also as relevant is the contact of cultures and non-contact cultures. Some cultures are very uh, when they meet a stranger, let's give an example of this. Some cultures, upon meeting a stranger, you kiss on both sides of the cheek. This is an example of personal space, gauge, and touch that is uniquely connected to cultural identity. Or some cultures have a non-contact rule or, part of their culture where it's you don't touch, you bow. You are very quiet. You are very respectful in even the delivery of content. And when do you speak? This is a nonverbal communication. The fact that you don't speak when you first meet someone in some cultures is a nonverbal communication cue. So when we talk about contact cultures, members of these contact cultures, examples are Latin American communities and cultures, Southern European nations. They use more touch and less personal space than do members of so-called non-contact cultures. Examples of non-contact cultures that prefer a visual mode of communication would be North American, Asian, and Northern European nations. So just remember those as examples of nonverbal communication. We have used nonverbal communication and cues every week in our class. We've adopted a new nonverbal cue. So just know that there's even a cultural distinction in nonverbal cues and nonverbal communication. There's also the importance of facial expression, gestures. When we talk about gestures, there are three dynamics I want to point to your attention. There's a multi-message gesture, which has more than one agreed upon meaning. So typically an example of this is when one culture differs from its meaning than another. The best example that the book provides is a four-finger thumb circle gesture, which means okay in America, but zero or worthless in France, a bad word in parts of Latin America and in the Middle East, and it means money in Japan. So even the well-known thumbs up gesture that has some meaning that could create problems for its users in Australia, it means up yours. In Japan, it means 5. And in Germany, it means 1. So these are examples, again, where there are multi-message gestures that are taken into context when we're thinking about cultural identity. And if we're to communicate with people of different cultures, we need to be aware of these. Sometimes different gestures communicate the same basic message. Discovering a multi-gesture message is a clear reminder of the great cultural diversity that is so characteristic of communication. Now, also know that there are unique gestures. Unique gestures are exclusive to a single location. At most, the deliberate action needed to properly perform an emblematic gesture rules out the possibility of an inadvertent communication. So let's give you an example of this. How do you cross your legs when you're seated? An innocent act of ankle to knee leg crossing, typically most American males, could be mistaken for an insult. Foot show gesture in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Singapore, and Thailand. Do you ever touch your earlobe? Depending on how you touch it, you could be saying, I don't like him in Russia. Or you can even say, don't argue with me in Saudi Arabia. I don't believe you in Scotland, or good luck in Turkey. So they're unique gestures that are particularly adapted in understanding the cultural identity and communication. So all of this is super important, and it comes down to, again, the importance of understanding the basic elements of cultural context, including nonverbal communication. Of course, there's the vocal expression. That is tied to the speech accents. Speech accents is the sound of speech that characterizes a particular group. No doubt it influences our ability to both encode and decode the accents. But when we talk about the dark side of cultural identity, what we found is that some cultures are, again, discriminated against simply because of the accent. Of the accent that one's community or culture has in communicating. Let's discuss the cultural differences in the use of communication. Understand that there is distinction between language and thought, the verbal communication style, which can be high context or low context communication, as well as the difference between the cultures. High text communication or message is one in which most of the information is either in the physical context or internalized in the person, while very little is in the encoded, explicit, transmitted part of the message. While low context communication is just the opposite. The mass of the information is vested in the explicit code. An example of this is twins who have grown up together can and do communicate more efficiently at a high contextual level of communication than two people who are in the midst of a conversation in a professional setting, which would be a low context communication style. Understand also that there's a direct and indirect style of communication when we're considering verbal communication styles. A direct style is blunt and straightforward. The speaker says exactly what is on his or her mind, leaving little doubt to the meaning of the message. With an indirect style, the speaker beats around the bush instead of saying exactly what they think. They're often with a collectivism perspective that they just want to avoid conflict and they want to go along with the decision and the perspective of the mass of people. Implications for intercultural encounters. When we think about the implications for intercultural encounters, we have to understand that as a population, particularly on our campus, we are increasingly diverse. We're bound to interact with more people who have cultural backgrounds that are different from our own. We shouldn't assume that the people that we meet communicate by the same set of rules that we do. And it's important to understand how the development of communication skills must take into account the impact of cultural differences. When we're understanding this perspective, we have to examine conversations and how to manage conflicts. So conversation skills are comprised of greeting and leaving and taking, turning and taking, exchange information, and encouraging politeness. When you're greeting and leave taking, it's how we enter and exit a conversation. It can vary from culture to culture. Do we enter the conversation with our phone in our hand? We look up and we gaze at the person and we greet them and then look back down at our phone. Depending on the culture, that could be taken as being extremely rude. Do we shake their hands when we greet? Not everyone shakes hands as a part of their greeting ritual. Some cultures bow. And for instance, Japan. Other forms of touch, such as hugging and kissing, are more common in some cultures than others. Kind of what we talked about before, but just know the way you enter and you leave a conversation and a meeting and a greeting with someone who has identified with a culture that is unique and different from your own, you want to make sure that you understand that perspective. Okay. Turn taking. This is an example of who takes turns when they're speaking and when they're listening. This is also an important piece to understand. Exchanging information. One reason we participate in conversations is to exchange information. It's super important to understand that there's a dynamic connection between high context cultures, which fosters the impression of being more attentive and favoring qualifiers such as maybe, perhaps, and probably, versus speakers in low context cultures, which are consistent with their preference for an instrumental style of communication to avoid comments that are not directly relevant to the topic being discussed. When we talk about politeness, the desire for politeness in conversation is more than just a driving force in some cultures. In some cultures, it is a deal breaker. Politeness is important in linguistics and understanding that some cultures are dead line in the sand set on not imposing, not giving options, and not allowing the person to have an opinion at all. We want to make sure that we encourage politeness in conversation because it is important to bail us out if we don't know the rules of that culture, especially when we are dealing with, again, a culture in a professional setting or even friends. We don't want that person to feel uncomfortable. So some of the rules are to express a desire not to impose, to give the person options, and to make the other person feel good. When we talked in class about the sheep head, you want to be polite because you don't know if you turn down the eating of a sheep's head in a restaurant around friends, how that's going to impact your friendship or your business relationship. So we want to be prepared for that. On the flip side of this area of implications for intercultural encounters, we want to make sure that we understand conflict management skills and that cultures have different perspectives on conflict. They have different perspectives on resolving conflict. In fact, individualistic cultures are outcome oriented, where collectivist cultures are process oriented. Understand the difference between those. As we move on, intergenerational culture, something that we often hear about are the labels that are given to intergenerational cultures. So we have read this over our chapter, but I wanted to include a few extras on this slide for your knowledge and education. So on this slide, we talk about the time frames of the years and the generational labels that are given to each generation. The greatest generation is the beginning of the labeling here. We have baby boomers, millennials. We have mature salients. So take a look at this slide. It's super important to know where you fit in terms of the intergenerational culture, as well as where your parents fit and your grandparents fit and your elders in your family, because there are distinct nuances to the beliefs, to the ideologies, as well as the drivers that motivate these cultures and these intergenerational cultures. Here, these slides, I explain the categories. Definitely review those as they talk about the individual characteristics of each generation. And here, this concludes our discussion of chapter 8. And I'm really excited to, again, I can't impress enough upon the fact that cultural diversity is so rich and it's so incredibly accessible on our campus and where we are currently studying this material. I encourage you to take the moment, take the time to plug into different cultural groups on campus just so you can learn and you can expand your knowledge, because I don't know once you graduate if you ever will have the opportunity to be in the middle of such a rich, diverse, vast group of diverse people and have access to learn about the various cultures that mold and shape our academic bubble. Thank you for your attention, and I can't wait to connect with you on the next lecture. Bye for now.